ليس اليتيم الذي قد مات والده، إن اليتيم يتيم العلم والأدب.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, from wherever you're joining us. I'm Saf Chowdhury. This is another episode of Islamic Literary Society podcast where we interview renowned authors on groundbreaking works, groundbreaking books and publications in the field of literature, politics, theology, sociology, whatever is related to the Islamic world and the Muslim diaspora. I really can't wait to introduce our author. But before I do that, I've got to mention a few things about ILS. Every episode, we do introduce what ILS is. We say something about us. The Islamic Literary Society, ILS, was founded in 2019 with the aim of promoting, fostering, and developing a heightened appreciation of authors and literary works of classical contemporary scholarship. This is accomplished by way of reading books, book launches, having talks with published authors and other speakers, critical reviews of books and any publications, events, whether online or on site, discussion and membership meetings. The aim really is to encourage a kind of a revival of readership of things related to Islam in our day-to-day lives, and to increase literary awareness amongst readers and members, and of course the general public. What we do generally at ILS is we try and nurture an interest and zeal in the reading of either Islamic literature or on Islam. And we try and do this through the promotion of classical modern books, interviews, as I mentioned, authors, exploration of book reviews, audio and video material, and we try and provide a platform for writers to showcase their work. We try and be a hub for book lovers to share their book interests and showcase what they feel is the best examples of Islamic literature and literature on Islam and the Islamic world. And so through the contributions, whether it's through members and the general public, we hope ILS can provide or support a vision of prosperity in encouraging the promotion of readership, the expression of readers' opinions through an intellectual forum, and develop new readers' interest in Islamic literature. So that's what we've been doing over the last few years. And, and that's only been possible really because of supporters who have helped the society, so we can get really, really good programs to you, events to you. Now, moving on to really the centerpiece of this evening, this afternoon, from where our guest is. This is a topic really that's a lot of people have been waiting for, and so we know there's been quite a buzz about it on social media. And this is the topic of the sort of plight of the Uighur community, and really, for today, we've got no one better to speak about it than Professor Sean Roberts at George Washington University. Before I sort of bring on the professor, I want to introduce him to our readers and viewers. Professor Sean R. Roberts is a professor of international affairs and director of the International Development Studies MA program at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Professor received his MA in visual anthropology and his PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Southern California, where he focused on the region of Central Asia and on the history and culture of the Uyghur people in particular. For his dissertation on the evolving cross-border relationship between Uyghurs from China and Central Asia, respectively, he conducted extensive ethnographic research in the Uyghur communities on both sides of the border, and has continued to do research with Uyghurs in Central Asia, Turkey, Europe, and the United States ever since. He has written extensively in academic, policy-oriented, and popular publications about both Central Asia and the Uyghurs. The War on the Uyghurs, which is the book for today's episode, is Dr. Roberts' first book, and it was recognized by the US publication Foreign Affairs on their best books list for 2001. Professor Roberts, welcome to ILS.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure
Really?
and an honor.
Really, it's an honor. The honor is all ours, and the pleasure is all ours. Before we sort of launch into sort of talking about your book, I just want to set up the issue for our readers and viewers. There is many people are aware now, especially in the last sort of couple of years, the plight of the Uighur Muslims, and the sort of coverage it's now received internationally. A spotlight has been brought on China regarding its, sort of overt and covert, I suppose, systematic decimation of a community, and so there's been lots of protests, lots of analysis as to why this is the case, the implications and the effects of this systematic decimation and oppression. And many people have given analyses, many people have given their thoughts, many people have spoken about it, but really, I think Professor Roberts has captured in this book some really detailed and amazing research, but not just because of the information it gives in a very lucid and readable way. It's not, as readers will see, and those of you who have read and shared your views, you're not trapped in sort of academic jargon, and you don't stumble on sort of excessively academic or ornate prose, but it's very readable and understandable, and it hits the point. But in addition to that merit, the book also brings together, it looks at causes, and it looks at ideas, so causes and ideas, key factors that has led to the suppression of the Uyghur community, as well as looking at sort of ideational factors. And I think this is where there is that added strength to the book. And hopefully over the next hour or so that we can tease out some of what Professor Roberts' own research is in this book as we go on. And I really can't wait to get into it. I mean, just for our readers and viewers, you should be able to see a screen now with sort of Professor Roberts, of course, picture there, and sort of two different covers of the book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority, published by Manchester University Press. And so this is a fantastic book, and I think I'm not sure when the paperback's coming out, but I think most libraries in the UK have got it. All academic universities have got a copy. If you're at university, or if you have access to a major library, please do get the book and read it.
And there is a paperback out.
Oh, there is a paperback out now. Yeah, of course. We have the hardback. So the paperback's available. Again, please, if you're able to, grab a copy if you haven't already. Those are just some sort of some review sort of snippets I've got. There are glowing reviews in various journals and publications, and we can send some links to our readers and viewers on that. I mean, I don't want to waste time. I really want to get into it. Professor, question 1. Here's a quote from your book, page 7. You say that Islam has a long history amongst the Uyghurs, and today most Uyghurs identify as Muslims. While Islam in the Uyghur homeland is usually depicted as being affiliated with the Hanafi school of Sunni Islam, local practices are very diverse and syncretic, drawing from a long history of mystical Sufi traditions and indigenous religious practices. I guess my question then is, to start us off, is can you shed some light for us on this unique and fascinating community, because you know, even some politicians, I remember when the story broke global, if we can say that, what came into the global spotlight, there are many politicians, even Muslims in certain parts of the world, were not familiar with this community. Can you shine some light on this community for us?
Sure. So it's a community inside of the borders of China today that numbers about 13 million, or at least per the last census. There's also many Uyghur communities that have left their homeland.
Right.
The area they inhabit inside China, the Chinese government calls the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Many Uyghurs refer to it as Eastern Turkestan. It's a region that Uyghurs view as their homeland. And Uyghurs outside their homeland, in Turkey, in Europe, the US, the Middle East, and so on, continue to focus on their homeland as the place that they believe there should be a sovereign Uyghur state. I think that it's important to note, a lot of people, when they hear about Muslims in China, they assume that they're very connected to Chinese culture. This community, as well as the homeland of the Uyghurs, is very much situated in the Central Asian cultural milieu. So there's a lot of Persian and Turkic influences. Sufism, in many ways originates out of Central Asia, and the Sufi traditions there are very strong, as I mentioned in my book.
Yeah.
And although they have some Chinese influences, they also have influences from all over the Eurasian landmass.
Wow, yeah, I know you mentioned there, and it's in the quote, that the Hanafi school of Sunni Islam, many people will identify the Hanafi tradition with the subcontinent or Turkey, and so, yeah, but it's always been strong historically in Central Asia as well. Do they have any Arab? Are there any Arab connections to this community?
Well, I mean, there's not. Of course, it was an area that was, with the rest of Central Asia, that was conquered by the Arabs in like the 11th century, I believe, or actually, no, it was 8th century, I believe. And yet, I think that that's one of the reasons we see not a lot of attention from the Arab world to this problem, because I don't think a lot of Arab Muslims necessarily identify with the group of Muslims living in Central Asia.
Right.
They've kind of developed their own traditions. There's even, although Uyghurs will generally identify as Sunni Muslims, a lot of their practices have influences from Shia Islam as well, because they've long had interaction with the Persian world. And so there, of course, the Arabic script is used by the Uyghurs as well. And of course, Muslim scholars in the region learn Arabic, and also many Uyghurs historically have gone on the Hajj. And so they've certainly interacted with the Muslim world in the Middle East as well.
And do they have a diaspora? Do they have do they have coverage outside of Xinjiang province? Do you have a diaspora?
Yes, absolutely. So, there's a significant diaspora right across the border in Central Asia, particularly in Kazakhstan.
Right.
Part of that left the region in the 19th century during a period where the region had pushed back on the Qing Empire that controlled the region. And the Russians stepped into a part of the area and occupied it. And when they left and returned the territory to the Qing Empire, they invited Uyghurs and other Muslims living in this region to come over to Russian territory, which is now in Kazakhstan. But also after the Chinese Revolution, a significant number fled the country, and they initially headed towards Kashmir. Some went to Afghanistan. And from those places, they sought refuge in other Muslim states. There's a very famous Uyghur intellectual from that period, Isa Apeltekin, who went to Saudi Arabia, went to Egypt, went to Turkey, and several other destinations to ask for refuge for the community. And in the end, it was Turkey that accepted them. And so there's a significant diaspora there. And since that time, there's been periodic exoduses of Uyghurs from their homeland, going sometimes to Turkey. Some of them have also gone to Europe and the US, and there is a fairly substantial community in Saudi Arabia as well.
Interesting. Yeah, there's quite a range. I mean, and thank you for that, Professor, for that sort of overview.
And one thing I'd like to note as well is that Uyghurs talk about their homeland as being Eastern Turkestan, and that is largely because the kind of proto-states that were developed in the region in the early 20th century, where there were essentially revolts and short-term establishment of states in this region. They were all named Eastern Turkestan because they didn't only represent Uyghurs, but represented other Muslims in the region, including Kazakhs and Uzbeks and Tatars. And so the preferred name of the homeland has always been not a national name as much as a
regional,
a multinational name.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. I mean, with this overview, I guess just if I can just piggyback onto this first question, is not only, of course, have you had an academic or discursive engagement with, the Uyghur people, but you've also, you've had that kind of sort of intimate contact with the community. So, on a sort of a personal note, before we kind of move on to the kind of what led you then to, what was the inroad into studying this community? Of course, I know you've got an anthropology background, but what was it? What was the call?
Well, I'll try to keep this brief, but I was interested in college in studying Marxism and communist societies. And at that time, it was very difficult to go to the Soviet Union, but I was able to go to Yugoslavia. And when I got to Yugoslavia, I found that very few people in the country were interested in Marxism. And some of the issues that were really interesting at the time included nationalism and the relationship between Muslim populations and communities in the country and non-Muslim communities. So after that, I decided I wanted to study Islam in the Soviet Union, and I was able to study in Uzbekistan. And during my winter break, this was 1989-90, I went over to the Uyghur region of China and became introduced. I was introduced to this community, found them fascinating on many levels. One reason was they had really preserved Central Asian culture in ways that the people in Soviet Central Asia had not been able to do. Because really the Chinese government didn't have the type of societal control that the Soviet Union did, during those early decades, for the first 40 years of Chinese communist rule in the country. And also, I was fascinated by the fact that there were Uyghurs from the Soviet Union reuniting with Uyghurs from China and kind of trying to rediscover their commonalities while also being introduced to the differentiation between them that have been kind of developed through acculturation on both sides of the border.
But just on just that's fascinating. Just if I can put it like this, and please correct me if I'm using the right term, mainland China, so Muslims that are in the sort of central lands, geographically, is there a strong affinity with the Uyghur community?
But so, yeah, it is interesting. There's numerous Muslim communities in China. The largest Muslim community, which is really made up of different cultural communities, but they're all Muslims who speak Chinese, and they're identified as the Hui, which essentially means Muslim. And they're quite different than the Uyghurs in many ways. And there's different groups of them. There's some down in southern China near the coast. The Hui, they suggest their origin story is that Arab traders intermarried with Chinese women, and as a result, this community was born. But I think there's probably a lot of other things that happen in terms of basically Chinese adopting Islam and so on. And there's also a Hui community in the Uyghur region that are identified there often as Dungan. And there's there are close relations between Uyghurs and Dungans, but there's also a history of conflict between them over certain things.
Brilliant. Wow. I mean, we can definitely talk more about this, but we'll maybe come back to threads of this as we get through some of the questions. Professor, thank you for that. Now, I know, just to sort of mention before I sort of mention the second question. Now, in this book, I mean, you really don't. I mean, your points are driven with clarity. So there's no ambiguity in sort of what you're writing about, i.e., the points that you're putting across. There's very little ambiguity for the reader, and so this is one of the, as I mentioned, I touched on at the beginning. This is one of the real benefits of the book, and really importance of the book, that this isn't, you write in a sort of piercing way to get the points across, especially, sort of the kind of the points you make in a cumulative way, the different facets you're bringing to make your overall case. I guess I'm trying to follow chronologically each chapter for our viewers. So this second question probably ties a couple of chapters together. But let me read what the professor writes, and again, you can judge based on its clarity, and it's like this throughout the book. So just to begin the quote, over the past 2 years, the international community has become increasingly aware of the relentless persecution of the Uyghurs in East Turkestan. This is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region the professor mentioned at the beginning, by the authoritarian Chinese Communist Party. This ancient community has become stigmatized as enemies of the monolithic Chinese state that occupies its homeland. They have been subjected to collective punishment in the form of mass incarceration in concentration camps aimed at the so-called re-education. Between 1 million and 3 million Uyghurs disappeared into this dystopian prison state. The Chinese government claims these institutions are voluntary re-education camps designed to eradicate extremism amongst the Muslim population of East Turkestan. The reality is that they are part of a much wider strategy aimed at eliminating the separate ethno-cultural identity of the Uyghurs and effectively wiping them off the map as a separate ethnic group. This is just a glimpse of how the professor, glides through with the points. And I wish I can get quote point after point, but that is for you to get the book and read, viewers. So, but this is, the professor then goes on to unpack, much of what's in here and other statements made in the introduction. So my second question then is, Professor, what's the rationale behind the Chinese government's systematic decimation, as you put it in certain places, of the Uyghur peoples? What is it what's driving the Chinese government on this program of eradication?
Yes, so as I'm sure we'll get into further, the rationale, the stated rationale of the Chinese government is that it faces an existential terrorist threat from the Uyghur people. However, I think that in my book, I go through a lot of pains to dismiss the presence of an existential terrorist threat. I think that what the Chinese government is more concerned about is the territory of the Uyghur homeland. And it views the Uyghur people, and I should mention not just Uyghurs, but other Muslim groups in this region that are indigenous to this region, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, other Central Asian peoples. It views them as an obstacle to what the state wants in the region. And what the state wants to do in the region is it wants to develop it and make it look much more like the rest of China and feel like the rest of China and operate economically like the rest of China. And part of the reason for that is this area, if you look at a map, it's the northwest frontier region of the People's Republic of China. And Xi Jinping's flagship foreign policy project is called the Belt and Road Initiative. And it intends to build trade routes that go out from China, west, southwest, and essentially in all directions. But for the routes going west through Eurasia to Europe eventually, and the routes going southwest into Pakistan and into the Middle East, this region is key to those plans. The transportation has to run through these regions. The region needs to have the production capacity. It needs to have access to hydrocarbons. There's already lots of gas pipelines, oil pipelines coming in through this region. And I think the Chinese government initially during the 1990s and for a good part of the 2000s was trying to provide reasons for Uyghurs to essentially assimilate to a Han-centric culture. And they found resistance to that. And as a result, the Chinese government has kind of decided to aggressively move these people, dispossess them of their lands. In many ways, there's an ethnic cleansing aspect to this. There's also I think I term in the book a cultural genocide happening, where there's an attempt to erase the Uyghurs' culture. But I do see it very much connected to the land, and so I frame it as a settler colonial impulse on the part of the Chinese state to essentially erase the connection between this population and their homeland.
Definitely, and we hopefully will be touching on that as well a bit later on, because there are important notions you flag up, a re-emergence of certain practices, policies, and ideas, and definitely we'll be picking that up. And this Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, I think it's generally here. The belt is really the old Silk Road, isn't it? The economic belt. For those familiar with the geography. So this construction, we can say of like a unified, I don't know, large market or international or transnational market it's quite surprising that much of that is driven by this economics, because I think the BRI plan is to be completed by 2050 or 49 or something like that. I can't remember. In 20-30 years time. So it's obviously, and it's wedded into the constitution, right? I can't remember if it is or not, but it's something like that. It's part of now China's sort of vision forward.
Yeah. And I mean, and the government is experiencing issues, in financing it elsewhere, going forward and so on. But I think when this started happening, it was at a time where the government just wanted any sense of discord in the region erased, so that it could start building up this region in preparation for this large multinational transportation and trade network that the state was building.
Now, I know obviously this BRI plan is expand industrial capacity, integrating commodity-rich countries and things like that into the Chinese economy. Of course, the US is critical of that. It sees Chinese, encroaching Chinese influence and things like that. What's the American sort of voice on this now at the moment? Obviously, many people regionally see this global China as the global growth engine, and it being a positive because it's connecting and moving Asia, Europe, and Africa closer together in some sense. So what's the US see it at the moment? Still a kind of unwanted growing influence, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think the United States is quite concerned about the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, personally, as somebody that teaches international development, I teach a class on it, and we look at both the positives and negatives of it. I think that for many countries, it provides a lot of promise, and in many ways, the best case scenario would be that it generates from the United States and Europe more interest in competing with China for building economic growth engines throughout the developing world, right? That would be the best case scenario, because the one thing I think that the Chinese initiatives lack, that you see having been developed over decades in the West, is a sense of accountability, making sure that you're not displacing indigenous peoples, for example, when you're building infrastructure, making sure that there's concerns about the environment and human rights are taken into consideration. Those things are not being pushed at all by the Chinese government, which is not surprising. But ideally, you would see that competition create more accountability on the Chinese side. And I do think the fate of the Uyghurs, it should be detached from any kind of discussion of whether or not the Belt and Road Initiative is a good thing for countries outside China's borders. But it is concerning that part of constructing it seems to necessitate the displacement and dispossession of the Uyghur people.
I guess one of China's sort of arguments be, it wants to part of this, as you mentioned, this the sort of oppression of the Uyghur peoples is for them a kind of stabilization policy, a stabilization pathway, because they don't want ethnic unrest, right? Whether in the western regions of Xinjiang or even in the south, is it southwestern in the Yunnan, the areas bordering, Vietnam, Laos, those kind of areas. So
yeah, and I think that what you're seeing is it's very similar to the reason I think that the settler colonial frame is so helpful is that if you look at other instances of settler colonialism, and in the Chinese sense, it's interesting because it's kind of a contiguous settler colonialism. It's an expansion of empire, right? It's not, the British in Australia. So it shares more commonalities, I think, for in terms of what happened in the United States, after the initial colonization of North America. Centuries later, you have this push in the U.S. to the west that displaces all the Native American peoples, and the impetus for that is also just capitalism and generating capital, because nothing generates capital better than land. And we see it also in terms of Russia's push into Siberia, also in the 19th and 20th centuries. But they're very similar processes, and of course, from the framework of the way a state sees the problem, these people are potentially a source of discord, a source of conflict, right? The way the native people see it is the state is steamrolling over them.
Brilliant, fascinating. So much, this network of factors. Of course, we can analyze them, and rightly so. But there's so much to unpack. I know time is sort of ticking a bit, but I'm telling you, the questions are going to now dig deeper into Professor Roberts' analysis from his book. And so our third question really is the following, and this I thought was a lovely formula, I think, for people to remember. And this GWOT is a brilliant abbreviation, the Global War on Terror. So I just want to quote the professor from page 6 of the book, and then pose the question. The Global War on Terror, that's the GWOT abbreviation there in the quote. The Global War on Terror has allowed the use of the terrorist label to justify the blatant suspension of human rights for entire populations based on their racial, religious, and or ethnic profile, conveniently lending itself to genocidal strategies. In the context of GWOT, the terrorist label marks an existential threat that has been used to justify a variety of atrocities against those who become branded with this label. Furthermore, since what constitutes a terrorist is not clearly defined, but is assumed to refer to a threat that is hidden within a larger population, the identification of a terrorist threat within any given group of Muslims can quickly justify the suspension of human rights for, and perhaps genocidal acts against, an entire category of people. Stark depiction there. So what I see is this formula of Chinese sort of colonial relation with the Uyghurs and this global war on terror, merging together to then unleash this sort of unprecedented repression, as you put it. So Professor, can you sort of elaborate on these two sides of the equation, you could say? So, this formula of Chinese colonial relations and this GWOT, how has it created this? How is it that it's created this powerful Chinese, sort of Chinese-driven repression? Can you elaborate?
Yeah.
Those three chapters rather, are brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah, I should mention first, that when I started writing this book, it was right before we started to get information about the Chinese government's creation of mass internment camps, and a lot of the things that have been identified as genocidal since then. And so the original idea of the book was really to look at the impact of the global war on terror on the Uyghurs. And as a result, that kind of the central part of the book is about how Uyghurs' fate intersected with this global war on terror. So there was already in the 1990s a very significant tension between Uyghurs and the Chinese state. And there were periodic crackdowns, political arrests, executions, and so on. And always the Chinese government would receive significant criticism from the outside world for its crackdown on these populations. But I think the advent of the global war on terror really changed the equation in a way that, because the United States, having started this war, as much as various governments in the United States tried to articulate that this was not a war on all Muslims, it essentially racially profiled all Muslims as potentially terrorists, and terrorists being also viewed as irrational, right? So not having any real grievances, but having somehow this ideological irrationality that drove their violence. And so immediately the Chinese government, as they saw this narrative kind of unfolding from the United States, and also being, by the way, marketed by the United States as a global war and trying to get lots of allies around the world to sign on to doing their own bit in fighting terrorism, the Chinese government immediately said, "Oh, we recognize this problem. This is the Uyghurs," and so they tried to kind of construct a logic for branding Uyghurs as both terrorists and also explicitly connected to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And what was interesting is initially Western states did not really pay much attention to this argument from the Chinese government, and in fact really pushed back on it and said, well, this is a little bit different. The problem you're having with integrating Uyghurs into the Chinese state is a little bit different than the problem we're talking about. But then suddenly, when the US needed more international support to kind of justify its invasion of Iraq, the United States changed its mind and recognized one, until that time, almost unknown Uyghur militant group in Afghanistan as a terrorist group. And that really opened the floodgates in a way that allowed the Chinese government to brand any kind of Uyghur descent as a reflection of terrorism. And of course, linking that to an idea of Islamic extremism and linking it to religion explicitly allowed for an attempt to kind of erase the Islamic nature of Uyghur culture entirely.
Yeah, I know you, I know you know, and you highlight that sort of the Uyghur community provincially, their relation with China as a state, by having their grievances robbed from them, effectively dispossessing them of any any way of making protest, but by robbing them of their grievances, then you're ineffectively you're setting up the enemy as irrational, as you mentioned. These are this is a harmful community. So I guess yeah, you're right about that. The other thing I want to, just because it slips my mind, because I can't remember what page you mentioned it in the chapter on colonialism, is I think you mentioned that it's a bit of an academic taboo to mention that China's relation with the Uyghurs is colonial.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting thing, because it's kind of, that has changed since the book was written.
Right.
To be frank, it's interesting, and I think I'd like to.
In a good way? Change in a good way?
Yes.
Okay,
you know, I'd like to take some credit for that, but I think it's
Brilliant.
more than just my book. I think there, you know, it kind of comes out of a resurgence of decolonialism, you know, in popular culture, in academic culture throughout the world. And it kind of goes back to this idea that colonialism by most academics was essentially identified with European states,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So, well, a lot of people, you know, in the last 20, 30 years writing about the Uyghurs' relationship with China kind of shied away from calling it colonialism because they felt that, well, it's different than the UK in India. It's different than you know, the Belgian state in the Congo, you know, and it is different in the sense that it's contiguous, but it's certainly, you know, an expansion of the empire, and it includes, I think, all of the same malaises of other colonial experiences. And so I think that we're increasingly starting to see an acceptance of this idea that, yes, you know, colonialism is not only European, it can be Asian as well. It can be anywhere. It's not something that's bound to this certain period of time of European hegemony globally, and also a realization that, you know, people in other parts of the world have suffered at the hands of other hegemonic states.
Yeah, because I think you mentioned that, you know, academics, of course, are less reticent now to use the label colonialism, and you mark some differences between sort of 20, you know, sort of the decline of empire in the 20th century, but China still essentially, even pushing into the 21st century, is still extending that sort of colonial arm. And then, you know, you've got colonialism extending to the 21st century, then you've got a geographical region that is still a region that is geographically contiguous with China. And so, you know, this is, yeah, I think you mentioned it's kind of either settler colonialism or there was another form of colonialism. I can't remember what you mentioned, but frontier colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
But so, yeah, so, yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting because I do think you know, decolonization, you know, however we think of the concept, has to begin with the recognition of colonization, right? And so, you know, you're definitely correct. You know, I make this point in the book that part of the problem that Uyghurs experience in China is the Chinese state, and I think by extension, the Chinese populace has never really recognized that this is a colony of China. In fact, the Chinese government goes to great lengths to essentially fabricate historical narratives that the Uyghurs have always been Chinese, and actually they're only influenced by Turkish conquerors.
Yeah.
And you know, it seems laughable, but I think it's very important to the Chinese state to create this idea that all of China is somehow this ahistorical civilization that has been in existence, you know, since time immemorial, and you can't say that any of it could be separated, and any of it could be different. But you know, anybody who's been to this region, particularly if you've been to the region, well, it's very difficult to go there now. But if you had been there, you know, 30 years ago, you would immediately be struck by the fact that it doesn't feel like the rest of China. It's very much a different cultural milieu.
Interesting. Oh, we are moving on, viewers and readers, to our next question. This is another concept Professor Roberts introduces into the book, and which I found I'm not sure if it's been applied in other sort of parallel case studies, but this I felt in chapter 5 was a very, very interesting concept. And so I wanted to, this was sort of my kind of question I wanted to sort of get the professor to expand on, and it's this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. So here's a quote from Merton, who says, Robert K. Merton, well-known sort of historian, sociologist, a false definition of the situation evoking a behavior which makes the originally false conception come true. Now, given that definition of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that terse definition, you pick up on this idea. Of course, you mentioned the self-fulfilling prophecy and the people's war on terror in chapter 5. Can you explain how this relates to the issue of the Uyghur community? How is this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy related to this issue?
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting because Merton, was a sociologist I think he started writing in the 40s, and he was very much focused on the United States, and he was using this concept to describe the ways that structural racism reinforces itself. So the example of, let's say, the assumption that African Americans did not really take to education led to less investment in African American education, which led to worse results, which confirmed the assumption that they are not really interested in education, right? So, I think that we see this with the Uyghur population, because first of all, I should mention this point. The thing that really struck me when I started researching the war on terror was the fact that there is no internationally accepted definition of terrorism. And I thought, wow, we've been engaged in this very amorphous war globally for at that time, I guess, 20 years, and yet there's no definition of what it is that we are allegedly fighting. And I think there's some popular understandings of what terrorism is, and I try to provide my own definition in the book, which is that it's violence that's deliberately targeting civilians. And most of the violent resistance we saw from Uyghurs for some time after the Chinese government had essentially labeled them as terrorists, and before as well, have been focused on security forces, have been lashing out at symbols of the state, and had not attacked civilians. And yet, after almost, over a decade of the state essentially framing any kind of Uyghur dissent as terrorism, about 2013, 2014, we see some violent resistance acts undertaken by Uyghurs that I would classify as terrorism, because they do target civilians. And there's only a handful of them, but it's this kind of result. You brand people, you say, anything you do that is voicing dissent or discord about state policies is considered terrorism. Eventually, there's a group of people who decide, well, then we might as well be terrorists. And I think that it was a difficult issue to deal with for a long time, because I think in academic circles among people studying the Uyghurs, because there was such a feeling, at least in the United States, that voicing any kind of sympathy for alleged terrorists was itself seen as an act of being with the terrorists, right? And so people were very unsure how to deal with these acts that took place in 2013, 2014, where Uyghurs, there's one incident where a Uyghur family drove an SUV into Tiananmen Square and hit some civilians. There was a bombing at the Urumqi train station inside the Uyghur region. There was an incident where a group of Uyghurs allegedly stabbed Chinese civilians at a train station outside the Uyghur region. And, people felt very concerned about, how do we discuss this? Is there really this existential terrorist threat?
Yeah.
And I try to unpack that and look at, how this happened, because it happened after you had this cycle of resistance followed by repression, making more resistance, harder repression, and it just at a certain point spirals into just more violent acts, and acts that can be characterized as terrorism.
Yeah, I guess the self-fulfilling prophecy gets it grows stronger when you have these counteractions by those who are repressed, because it enables you to now say, it enables you to construct that self-fulfilling prophecy. So yeah, it's one of those dangerous loops.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's. I mean, you could make this argument in general about the war on terror, that it's, kind of targeting of Muslims, racially profiling Muslims as potential terrorists, has only spawned more terrorists. Because there's people who become more and more alienated, and then find groups that are willing to invite them in, and then it turns out that we have real terrorists again.
Yeah.
And whereas I think if the issue of September 11th had been dealt with very differently, you wouldn't have this never-ending war that is really, it's self-perpetuating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're right about that. And this is, again, this whole sort of war on terror policy, as you mentioned, China taking a leaf out of the sort of US book in that sense. There's a lot to be said, I guess, about that, and we can go down that path, I guess, in another episode, which I'll be excited to definitely do. But we're focusing for the time being on the book, which takes us on to our sort of next question. This is where Professor Robert sort of takes us after sort of laying out all these sort of accounts in a cumulative case for his argument. He sort of does mention now some sort of some directions, whether that's related to actions or some kind of predictions about how things, also kind of forecasting about how things will look, or are looking and will look in the near future. So these are a couple of questions I want to capture from that part of the book. And so here's one. So Professor, you mentioned in the conclusion of your book, certain strategies, you suggest certain strategies in moving forward with this sort of international tragedy, or the plight of the Uyghur community. One, you mentioned one way to sort of try and, I guess, one strategy is to redefine terrorism, which you've talked about, it being so nebulous and a term which is sort of ill-defined, and then to pressure China. Can you explain a little bit more and whether you think they're effective?
Yeah. So, I mean, I do think that, we're at the point 20 years after this nebulous kind of war on terror that the international community should actually come up with a legal definition, because if we're seeing the kind of punishment for alleged terrorism, this should be something that is objectively defined. So I think that's something. Experts in terrorism suggest that will never happen, that states have too many vested interests in being able to leave it ambiguous. And it's this problem of one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, and states want that flexibility to brand those non-state actors that they want to destroy as terrorists, and those they want to support as freedom fighters. But in reality, I don't think even that will help the Uyghurs at this point. Might stem further actions by other states that are similar to what's happening to the Uyghurs. Right. And I should mention that, in particular, the present crisis facing the Uyghurs, and I won't go into all the details, and hopefully people have seen plenty of news items on it, but it really starts in around 2017, 18. And that's when we start to see Uyghurs disappear. We start to see these massive internment camps and a concerted effort to wipe the Uyghur population out, and not necessarily killing them, but altering them, dispossessing them from the land, and trying to essentially forcibly assimilate them and marginalize them in Chinese society. And I think that this process is not. I think that it runs the danger of it continuing for another 5 years to really being successful in the same way that we've seen what happened to Native Americans in the United States, where they've been basically marginalized in their homeland, and other indigenous peoples, the Aboriginal people in Australia and so on. So I do think there's a real imperative for the international community to act on this. Now, the United States has been very active, and many European states have been. And I certainly don't discourage those kind of state actions, but unfortunately, they tend to end up kind of becoming entangled with geopolitical issues, right? And then it's who do you believe, the U.S. or China? And I think that really, if we're going to see any change in behavior by the Chinese state, it requires grassroots mobilization. And I think the pressure that needs to be applied is economic, because the reasons for the state's actions against Uyghurs are really economic, in the sense that it's an attempt to develop this area, make it a central part of the rise of China as kind of the growth engine of the world, as you put it. So I think it's pushing back on that, and we're seeing some of that happen. We're seeing there's some organizations now that have popped up that are trying to track forced labor products, because one of the things that, in addition to these mass internment camps, and is kind of the follow-on institutions to them, we have residential factories where Uyghurs are essentially put in against their will, and they're limited in their movements, and they're producing lots of the parts of the global supply chain. Now, of course, it becomes very difficult to follow those supply chains, is one thing we're finding. But I think it's really worthwhile to put pressure on the Chinese state to suggest that this is not acceptable behavior. I think that one of the problems with our neoliberal global economy is that we're so reliant on economic interdependence that nobody wants to kind of interfere with these supply chains. And there's certainly a lot of corporate interests trying not pay any attention to this problem. But it's exactly where that nexus of the global economy and the fate of the Uyghurs happens, that I think is where pressure can be put on the Chinese state to change its behavior.
Yeah, the Middle East, supplying oil, Indonesia, Of course, Pakistan has been relatively silent under Imran Khan at the time. There was, so these countries, other Central Asian countries, they can squeeze China back, quite hard.
Yeah, and I think, unfortunately it's, in part with states, it's greed, right? Nobody wants to, Pakistan has staked most of its future development on China and the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor that's being built. And, Imran Khan was trying to constantly say he knew nothing about what was happening to Muslim Uyghurs. And, I think that the current prime minister is essentially following the same party line. And we also have not heard anything from the Middle Eastern states. No. That said, I do, I've talked to journalists in Indonesia, in Central Asia, in Turkey, people in Muslim civil society in these Muslim majority countries, they know about what's happening, and they are concerned about it. And so I guess one of the hopes is that those people can put pressure on their governments to pressure China.
Brilliant. Right, I think we've got maybe a couple of more questions, Professor. Sorry again for sort of piling on the interrogation, but loving the discussion. And this part, I think readers, have got the book, I'm sure. It's a short part, short sort of almost like a postscript, but it can be a book in itself. So you identify 3 trends that have emerged, as I see it, in reflecting state behavior as agents of power and force. And talked about some sort of sort of acts of state terrorism, things like that. You mentioned three trends that we've moved rather into a post-privacy world, a post-rights world, and something which you alluded to at the beginning of our discussion, the racist logic of settler colonialism. Now you got to tell me a bit more about these for our readers and our viewers. So please.
Yeah. Well, so, we haven't really talked about this aspect of the Chinese state's repression of Uyghurs, but it's very much driven by a lot of electronic surveillance.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of information out there for people who haven't read about that. But, a lot of the concerns about this electronic surveillance are concerns that we should all have, that our internet browsing history is subjecting us to the same intrusive surveillance every day. And what you have to be careful about is trusting that your government, if it's more democratic, say, than the People's Republic of China, that it will do the right thing. That can change over time. And so I think that it's a very much what's happening to the Uyghurs is a cautionary tale about the power of electronic surveillance and what that can mean for the future of the world. And the Chinese government is also essentially marketing a lot of its products that it's using for the mass surveillance of Uyghurs to other states who want to control their own populations. And I think it's becoming kind of increasingly legitimate for a state to want to control their populations. And again, I also would suggest that the kernels of the origins of this go back to, again, the global war on terror, when you started to identify within a population this existential threat that you have to weed out. So, the original sin in the United States was the Patriot Act, which allowed the government to surveil all our phone calls and internet interactions. In terms of the post-rights world, we're seeing a real challenge in and this again, all three of these, I also believe that the global war on terror kind of set dangerous precedences that we see in the example of what's happening to Uyghurs in China, but also have long-term larger ramifications. So, I mean, with the global war on terror, the United States kind of set a precedent for suspending human rights of terrorists, for example. The Guantanamo Bay Detention Center was notoriously extra legal detention, just like the internment centers that the Chinese government has set up. I mentioned as well the racial profiling and surveillance and so on. And what we're seeing now with the Uyghur issue is, the UN Human Rights Council has refused to even discuss this issue, and they had a vote on it, and the majority of countries voted against even discussing it under pressure from China. So we're seeing, I think right now, a disintegration of this idea of a rights-based international order of any kind. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think, is very much in danger globally. And explicitly, China and Russia is pushing to redefine the way we understand human rights and say that, maybe civil liberties are not the most important aspect.
Inevitably, when you've got the sort of when you move into a kind of securitized framework, it allows the state now as an agent or actor to, use or enable or activate extraordinary means, because in the name of security, and that inevitably would mean you forfeit your subjects' rights or your citizens' rights.
Exactly.
Because you're transforming your citizens or subjects from mere you're turning into sort of object of security. So, sorry, but you were saying something before I interrupted you on that.
No. I think that's entirely right. There has evolved this kind of false dichotomy of freedoms versus security, right? And you see authoritarian states exploit this all the time. And you see democratic states exploit it all the time, because states, generally want more control. And I think that this is a slippery slope that we have to be very concerned about. And I do think it's important, there's an attempt, I think, by some states to kind of label the idea of human rights as a Western liberal concept, and that, it's part of Western colonization of the world. But I think rights are something that are much more than that, and really it's important to see, I think, not just states fight to uphold the idea of human rights, but it's really important that we see grassroots movements around the world to do so. And the last point, I would say, I kind of frame it around, I guess, two concepts. One is this idea of identifying a population as an existential threat, which was a core aspect of the global war on terror, and that leads states to believe that wiping out a population, or at least quarantining it, putting it under control, is an acceptable policy option, which I think is very dangerous. But it's also, I think, combined with something that has been occurring for, I think, since the end of the Soviet Union, and the kind of creation of this neoliberal global economy, as we're finding politicians around the world we don't really have a lot of different economic policy models. So we're not seeing politicians run on different economic policy models, because your models are either you're part of the global economy or you're not. And so the low-hanging fruit for politicians is populist nationalism.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this, Xi Jinping, and he's very much a part of what's happening to the Uyghurs. It's not just a structural problem of the Chinese state. It's also driven by Xi Jinping, who is very much a populist nationalist and is trying to fan the flames of a Han-centric Chinese nationalism that is not accepting of difference. But we saw this in the United States, with the Trump administration, and we're seeing it going forward with other politicians. We've seen it in Brazil. We see it in India with Modi. So there's really, I think, a danger that we're heading towards a different kind of global order where nationalism is much more a pronounced part of it. And you don't have to look any further than Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and that being completely framed as a nationalist war. Experts in international relations for years have been talking about the new wars, which are intrastate, between different factions within states and not between states. But I think we might be heading towards a much more prominent era of interstate wars, like the ones we thought we left behind after World War II.
Yeah, no, you definitely make a reference to that sort of ominous and impending. It began with, it's not me yet, but that Bonhoeffer sort of a statement. It's I think, because you allude to it all the time. So long as there's that settler native dichotomy, the settler is never going to become like the native, and so it's a few policies. Either you try and forcibly assimilate, and then we know all the expressions of that forcible assimilation, these de-radicalization camps and these sort of incarcerations and things like that, or you depopulate or you eradicate. And you document that so vividly. And I guess this I felt it needed to be brought into the discussion. And I think, even though it was probably you mentioned it in a very short way, but I think that's powerful, and this needs to be taken up further. I think so it's a brilliant framework, a sort of foretelling framework, if I can put it that way, for our predicament now. Professor, last question. I know I've really kept you in your seat for a long time.
No problem.
Finally, how do you see them in the future of the Uyghur peoples? I mean, do you feel there's change in the air? Do you feel there's a pessimistic? Do you think there's an optimistic wind, or sort of a pessimistic gale?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think about really transformative changes, and basically, I think for the Chinese, one thing I point out in my book is that what the Chinese government is doing to the Uyghur people is really backing itself into a corner. There's no easy way out, because they've angered these people so much. Family members everywhere have disappeared. This has been explicitly ethnically profiled. So, Uyghurs do not feel comfortable as part of the Chinese state right now. So the only way to really kind of change the situation inside China is to see a transformative change. And those kind of changes, I think they happen, they're very gradual until they're not. There's a person who writes about change in development by the name of Duncan Green, and he points this out, the way that changes happen are sudden and that you can't really foresee them. So right now, one of the most interesting things happening in China is with this zero COVID policy that has been particularly draconian in the Uyghur region. It led last week to a large apartment building being locked down and then catching on fire, and a yet unknown number. Some of the reports say 10. Many of the people in the Uyghur community are always saying it's over 40 people were burned to death in this apartment building, and the state couldn't get fire trucks there or anything. But this has led to mass protests around China in solidarity with the people in this apartment building. And by most accounts, those people in the apartment buildings were primarily Uyghurs. And yet we're seeing Han Chinese voicing, anger about what's happening and asking for change in Xinjiang. And many analysts are saying, well, let's be very careful. We can't, this might just disappear. This might just be a one-off, kind of explosion of public outrage, but it could be something larger. So I think for the Uyghur people, many of those in diaspora feel that they're exhausted and nothing is changing, and they're trying to do everything they can. And I think the only hope is that suddenly there may be a change, but it's the type of thing that can't be predicted.
Brilliant. Yeah, the book that the professor was referring to is How Change Happens by Duncan Green. That is definitely worth a look at. I mean, this has been a fantastic discussion, Professor Roberts. Honestly, you've really meticulously, gone through, obviously touched on areas of the book, and I can only just say to the readers and viewers, get a copy of the book, and then you yourself can engage with the contents in it, the arguments, the ideas, the frameworks. So it just remains for me to say, I really, really appreciate, Professor, giving your time, and how busy you are with research, teaching schedules, and of course other engagements, national and international. And I want to thank as well, for you all for supporting ILS and the things we try and do here to raise conversations and carry on trying to inspire people, literature on Islam and Islamic literature. So yeah, I want to thank Professor Roberts again for giving his time for writing such a fantastic and necessary book. And we hope you, the audience, take what's in this book and take the discussion further. So until our next episode, we will see you all then. Assalamu alaikum.